People around the world watch as the cost of daily life climbs higher at the fuel pump and the grocery store. This universal struggle reflects a deeper global crisis as the ongoing war between the United States, Israel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran severely disrupts international energy markets and supply chains. The conflict has created the most massive disruption to the global oil supply in history. Prices for benchmark crude oil surged rapidly as traders react to the functional closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This critical maritime route normally handles 1/5 of global oil consumption every single day. Traders are heavily pricing in a severe war risk premium into the global energy market. The American benchmark known as West Texas Intermediate recently traded at a significant premium over the global Brent standard. This unusual market inversion highlights the intense stress placed upon maritime logistics and deliverability. Global crude prices reflected immediate panic following escalatory threats from the American administration. West Texas Intermediate crude futures for May delivery rose to more than $114 per barrel. Meanwhile, Brent crude futures also climbed significantly to exceed $111 per barrel. The price relationship where the American benchmark exceeds the North Sea global standard is an anomaly. This is driven by the perception that barrels produced in the United States are much more deliverable. These barrels completely avoid the current sea route bottlenecks threatening the broader Middle East. Divergence in pricing extends to regional and specialized benchmarks across the globe. The United Arab Emirates Murban crude climbed above $114 per barrel. This specific crude is highly valued for its ability to be moved from terminals that totally bypass the blocked strait. Conversely, the Russian Urals benchmark surged to over $120 per barrel. Buyers increasingly turn to sanctioned shadow oil fleets that operate outside standard insurance systems. They use these secret fleets to actively mitigate the total loss of normal supply from the Persian Gulf. The inflationary impact of these prices is already manifesting in the domestic American economy. Retail gasoline prices have surged past $4 per gallon nationally. Certain major urban markets are reporting prices well in excess of $6 at the pump for average civilian consumers. The rapid transmission of crude price spikes to consumer fuel costs is a primary concern. Both the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank are monitoring the situation closely. They search for dangerous signs indicating the development of an entrenched and damaging wage price spiral globally. The conflict entered a qualitatively more dangerous phase as target sets actively expanded. The United States and Israel moved from hitting purely military installations to targeting critical civilian infrastructure. This massive expansion severely threatens the underlying stability of energy production throughout the entire region. In the Iranian capital, the Israel Defense Forces conducted extensive waves of destructive strikes. They targeted air defense systems and ballistic missile arrays alongside various research and development sites. A pivotal strike was carried out on the Mashar petrochemical complex during this intense military operation. The Mashar petrochemical complex is widely known as the largest refining facility in Iran. It reportedly supplies nearly 70% of the country's domestic gasoline consumption needs. The functional paralysis of this highly essential facility represents a strategic shift toward undermining internal logistical capacity completely. The grave risk of nuclear escalation has increased following reports of strikes near critical facilities. A dangerous projectile fragment reportedly struck the Bushehr nuclear power plant, causing widespread alarm. Although the main reactor core remained untouched, the strike caused severe structural damage to an auxiliary building. This frightening incident promptly forced the Russian government to begin the urgent evacuation of its citizens. They successfully removed nearly 200 workers employed at the facility for their own safety. This move signals a dangerous breakdown in the deconfliction channels that had previously protected the site. The Iranian response involves deep strike ballistic missile attacks on several Israeli urban centers. They launched numerous ballistic missiles directed at northern Israel alongside Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The use of cluster munitions in civilian areas indicates an intent to maximize the psychological and humanitarian toll. The most potent weapon in the Iranian arsenal has simply been its strategic geography. Since the war began, the Strait of Hormuz has been transformed into hostile waters. The combination of drone swarms and sea mines has made commercial transit completely impossible for Western shipping fleets. Vessel tracking data indicates that tanker traffic through the strait has collapsed almost entirely. Before the hostilities began, the average daily transit stood at 84 massive vessels. Major maritime operators have suspended all bookings for the upper Gulf region, citing the complete inability to secure vessels. The mechanics of this blockade involve a highly sophisticated mix of various interdiction methods. Small fast attack craft and unmanned aerial vehicles consistently target vulnerable merchant shipping vessels. The terrifying threat of drifting mines has forced shipowners to anchor hundreds of vessels outside the strait to avoid loss. Electronic warfare tactics have also been identified throughout the waters of the Persian Gulf. Jamming clusters make safe navigation nearly impossible for any automated tracking systems currently deployed. This maritime freeze has forced a total cessation of exports from several of the largest energy producers in the world. QatarEnergy declared force majeure on gas contracts after being unable to move their tankers. Iraq has begun shutting down massive oil fields due to a lack of storage. Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates have similarly lowered their daily production, as storage tanks rapidly reached absolute maximum limits. The paralysis of the strait has triggered a massive rerouting of global trade routes. Ships are now forced to navigate around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. This massive detour adds thousands of miles to the average journey, while exponentially increasing fuel consumption and basic transit costs. For Southeast Asian nations, this has extended delivery times for absolutely critical industrial materials. The maritime insurance market is currently existing in a state of completely unprecedented turmoil. War risk premiums have spiked to 10%, making a single transit through the region unbelievably expensive for shipping companies. Reinsurers in London have begun issuing cancellation notices for comprehensive war risk coverage plans. This severely restricts the pool of available vessels and forces shipowners to seek alternatives. The overall economic cost of these global logistics disruptions is filtering quickly through to corporate earnings and impacting financial markets. In the aviation sector, jet fuel prices have experienced a massive and damaging surge. This has forced many commercial airlines to implement fuel surcharges or cancel routes entirely. To counter the sudden loss of global supply, international energy agencies have initiated the largest coordinated stock release in history. Member countries unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels from their emergency reserves. The United States has committed to providing a massive portion of this requested total. Unlike a traditional sale, these barrels are provided as loans to companies, which must be returned with a premium eventually. This mechanism is designed to stabilize markets while refilling the reserve at no cost. In tandem with supply measures, agencies proposed a radical plan for global demand reduction. These measures focus heavily on the transport sector, which accounts for nearly half of global oil demand during normal operations. Proposals include encouraging remote work to effectively eliminate the daily demand for commuting fuel. Agencies also recommend implementing speed limit reductions on all highways to optimize fuel efficiency. Subsidizing public transit could encourage a necessary modal shift away from private cars during this severe global emergency. Experts advise against business air travel, where digital alternatives exist to preserve jet fuel. They suggest shifting vehicles from liquid gas to preserve it for residential cooking needs. If these measures are widely adopted, they could reduce global demand by 1 million barrels per day during the crisis. The persistence of the conflict has led to a systemic revision of economic projections. The unpredictable nature of the war creates a baseline of uncertainty for global markets. Global gross domestic product growth is now projected to slow significantly, marking a major drop from the previously recorded year. The economic impact is most pronounced in energy-intensive and import-dependent developing economies. The combination of high energy intensity and reliance on imported hydrocarbons hurts credit ratings. Financial institutions have modeled a stress scenario that would likely trigger technical recessions across much of Europe if high prices persist. In the Asia-Pacific region, the situation is particularly acute for the Philippine economy. The World Bank has flagged a massive inflationary shock for the vulnerable island nation. Its heavy reliance on oil and fertilizer imports passing through Hormuz makes it uniquely vulnerable to sustained disruptions in maritime shipping. Headline inflation in Manila is expected to reach well above the central bank target. This severe inflationary pressure could potentially lead to immediate job losses and capital outflows. The agricultural sector is also facing a secondary crisis, as fertilizer prices are projected to rise significantly in the first half. Natural gas represents the primary feedstock for creating essential nitrogen-based agricultural crop fertilizers. As this gas becomes scarce, and expensive global food production costs will rise proportionally. This has already translated into a spike in global food prices, with sugar and vegetable oils rising rapidly in recent weeks. The sudden energy shock has produced a bifurcated reality for the global corporate sector. While integrated oil giants have seen their stocks surge, other vulnerable companies have struggled. Companies with significant exposure to Middle Eastern risk or high energy input costs are facing unprecedented operational and financial challenges today. Major energy corporations were downgraded due to a narrower path to pre-conflict pricing. Significant damage sustained by massive gas facilities in Qatar could take years to repair. In the insurance sector, the brutal war is being characterized strictly as an earnings event by leading financial risk assessment agencies. Property catastrophe reinsurers reported strong results, but have seen their stock price weighed down. Fears of increased catastrophe exposure related to the conflict have driven broader financial sell-offs. War risk premium hardening is expected to provide a tailwind for pricing power into the later stages of the year. The private technology sector remains a bright spot amidst the global macroeconomic market headwinds. Investors are enthusiastically buying the dip in artificial intelligence leaders, despite the geopolitical uncertainty. Venture capital remains robust, with nearly half of all deal flow directed toward companies promising a new technology supercycle moving forward. The immediate future of the global energy market hinges on pending American diplomatic deadlines. The administration has established a hard ultimatum requiring the immediate reopening of the strait. If the waterway is not reopened, the United States will systematically dismantle civilian infrastructure inside the borders of the targeted country. Analysts have identified two primary scenarios for the coming weeks regarding the ongoing conflict. If the military follows through on infrastructure strikes, escalation is the most likely outcome. Retaliation against remaining energy assets would push prices higher and result in a total cessation of seaborne trade in the region. Conversely, a de-escalation scenario could emerge if diplomatic backchannels yield a temporary regional ceasefire. A partial reopening of the strait could cause prices to retreat almost immediately downward. The relationship between oil prices and consumer demand is being tested globally, as price elasticity faces an unprecedented and historical strain. Academic research indicates that gasoline price increases typically reduce consumption in the short term. Current price increases are exceeding 30% in many major markets around the world. The impact on retail spending could be catastrophic if fuel remains at current elevated levels over an extended period of time. The war has permanently altered the global energy landscape and fundamentally shifted economic perspectives. The functional closure has demonstrated that maritime security is a central pillar of pricing. The emergence of a persistent war risk premium suggests that the era of low-cost and high-reliability energy has ended. Even if a ceasefire is achieved tomorrow, the damage to infrastructure has been done. The trauma to maritime insurance markets will ensure that energy costs remain highly volatile. Structural rerouting of supply chains around Africa will keep prices elevated well into the future, forcing the global economy to adapt. The world economy is navigating a period where resilience must be prioritized over optimization. This signals the dawn of a new and much more fragmented era in economics. As the conflict stretches on, countries recognize that energy independence and secure supply chains are matters of absolute critical national security. Asian economies are particularly exposed to the sudden disruption of Middle Eastern oil shipments. Japan depends on imported fossil fuels for a vast majority of its energy use. A sustained closure would widen its trade deficit sharply and weaken the yen, while tipping the Japanese economy towards severe stagflation. South Korea channels a massive portion of its crude imports directly through the strait. The nation has announced emergency contingency planning to address the sudden lack of supply. Officials note the country holds strategic petroleum reserves equivalent to roughly 200 days of supply to weather the current crisis. India also faces substantial exposure that is structurally significant for its rapidly growing economy. Half of its total crude imports were sourced from Gulf countries before the crisis. Any sustained disruption immediately feeds into domestic fuel prices and inflation, which negatively impacts the purchasing power of the national currency. China sits in a peculiarly contradictory position regarding the ongoing Middle Eastern military conflict. It is the largest oil importer and buys the vast majority of Iranian exports. Beijing has a direct interest in keeping Tehran financially viable, while ensuring that the critical maritime strait remains open for business. The European dimension of this severe energy crisis is often underestimated by global markets. Qatar sends almost all of its liquefied natural gas exports through the blocked strait. A sustained disruption severs access to a critical alternative to Russian gas at a moment when European energy security remains highly fragile. European utilities would be forced into expensive spot market procurements from alternative global suppliers. This action would significantly tighten industrial supply chains and raise household energy bills exponentially. A long closure would result in a massive supply decline that no amount of demand-side adjustment could ever fully absorb. The conflict has precipitated a second major energy crisis for countries across the Eurozone. The crisis coincided with historically low European gas storage levels following a harsh winter. Consequently, the European Central Bank postponed planned interest rate reductions and raised its inflation forecast while cutting economic growth projections globally. Economists warn that energy-intensive economies face high risks of entering a technical recession. This remains true if the maritime blockade persists through the crucial summer refill season. The crisis has further impacted industrial output, where chemical and steel manufacturers have imposed massive surcharges to offset surging electricity costs. This could potentially lead to permanent deindustrialization in some vulnerable sectors of the economy. The United Kingdom inflation rate is expected to breach 5% during the year. The severe energy supply shock and industrial strain have forced major economies to prepare for a prolonged period of devastating stagflation. Other regions are also feeling the devastating macroeconomic effects of the Middle Eastern. Countries in Africa are bracing for severe price shocks due to expensive petroleum imports. The crisis has provoked skyrocketing risk premiums and maritime insurance costs, which translate immediately into inflated import prices for these nations. Traffic through the Suez Canal has declined significantly, causing billions of dollars in losses. The Egyptian government is considering the conflict a direct threat to national economic security. Higher oil prices increase import costs and place extreme pressures on public finances, while complicating efforts to stabilize the national economy. The conflict has also severely impacted the global supply of essential industrial raw materials. The near-total halt of tanker traffic has caused a significant disruption for sulfur. Gulf countries account for 45% of the globally traded sulfur, which is essential for manufacturing vital agricultural crop fertilizers. This regional supply stoppage is projected to spike fertilizer costs across the entire planet. The crisis has also constrained the supply of helium, crucial for semiconductor manufacturing processes. World helium is largely produced as a byproduct of liquefied natural gas, which is now trapped inside the blocked maritime region. A prolonged conflict could lead to massive shortages of nitrogen and aluminum moving forward. The Gulf states produce approximately 9% of the world primary aluminum supply annually. An aluminum shortage directly impacts automotive, aerospace, electronics, and construction industries, while also driving up packaging costs for common consumer goods. Tungsten prices have surged as major producers restrict export to protect their domestic industries. Gold, once considered a safe haven against economic turbulence, decreased since the war began. Financial markets experience unprecedented volatility as central banks grapple with difficult rate decisions amid rising inflation and highly fragile supply chains. Global stock markets declined, reflecting deep fears of inflation and persistent supply chain issues. Emerging markets face severe currency pressures from a stronger dollar and rising energy costs. The world watches nervously as diplomatic negotiations stall and military threats escalate, pushing the global economy toward a devastating international recession.